G'day, podcasters. Welcome back to Season 4 of True Blue Conversations. I just want to give a shout out to our show sponsor, 254 Coffee, for troopers, by troopers. For all your coffee needs, head to www.254.com.au. G'day! Welcome to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Bloom. Today's special guest is former Royal Australian Navy veteran Sandy Coulson CSM. And Sandy served for 26 years in the Royal Australian Navy and 17 years in the reserves. And she has joined us today to talk about her career and her life after service. Hi, Sandy. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me along. It's great to be here.
No, Sandy, thank you. It's an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on. And as I said to you privately, you are the first Navy veteran that I've had on the show. So it's an honour to have you on. So thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. As I say, there are far more exciting naval careers than mine. So it's great that you picked me to be the first.
No, thank you. So, Sandy, let's start with you as a young woman growing up. What school did you attend?
Well, I grew up initially in Mount Gambier. My father's family were an old pioneering family. So I just attended the local infant and one of the primary schools in Mount Gambier. And I was dux of the local primary school, a fact that one guy has never forgiven me for, who came back here as well as an architect. So there you go. And then I did 2 years at Mount Gambier High School before a family tragedy made my father, who was a journalist, make the decision to move the family to Adelaide. My brother had been studying law at Adelaide University, and sadly he was killed in a car accident. Another driver didn't give way to his right, and my brother took the full force, being in the front passenger seat. My father decided that he didn't want another child going to Adelaide to uni by themselves, and so having been in Mount Gambier for probably about 140 years by then, his family, we up, the current lot up stocks and moved to Adelaide. And then I went to a fairly posh Anglican girls' school in Glenelg, and I was dux of that school as well, in arts and humanities, and another girl was dux in science. So this kid who came from a country high school showed him how it was done. Which gave my father enormous satisfaction, because he didn't really believe in private education. So
I know where you're talking about with Glenelg. So my family originally comes from South Australia, so I know where you're talking about, and it's a very upper. Yeah, I know where you're talking about Glenelg. So
and it's where the first settlers came ashore, was in Glenelg, and there's still the old gum tree, and they have a ceremony on Proclamation Day on the 28th of December. And of course, we South Australians pride ourselves on being the only state of free settlers.
So
I think my great-great-grandfather got out of Ireland before they actually got him. But anyway, that's so not have been a free settler.
So you attended university and you completed an arts degree. Can you share with us why you chose to study European language?
Well, I was always very good at languages at school. I'd been particularly good at Latin, which unfortunately is not much use to man, woman or beast in terms of employment. But I really enjoyed languages. And so for my degree, I studied French and Spanish. And in my honours year, I did Portuguese, which I found a fearsomely difficult language. But the other two I really thoroughly enjoyed. So it was just something that I really enjoyed doing, but I could see that I was going to finish up an academic, and I really didn't want to be an academic. That was waiting for me.
So did any of your family serve in the Defence Force, or were you the first in your family to serve?
My father was in the Air Force during World War II. My father was very short-sighted. He wore glasses like milk bottle, you probably don't remember milk
No,
bottle.
I do. No, I do. Yes, yes.
Oh, you do, yes. Well, his glasses resembled the bottom of milk bottles. So the Army really didn't want him, and most of the fellows from Mount Gambier were joining the Army. So he tried the Navy, and the only thing they would let him be with was a sick berth attendant, which is a medic, and he wasn't too sure that, seeing blood and that was really for him. So he tried for the Air Force, who accepted him. So he became a storeman in a bomber squadron and went to the UK in 1944 at the age of 19.
Okay, and you joined the Navy, and what was it about the Navy that made you join instead of the Army or the Air Force?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question. I went to the recruiting office, first in Sydney, and then because I was there on holidays, and then in Adelaide. Bear in mind that the women's services then were although they were part of the main service, they were separate services within, say, the Army, Navy or Air Force. So I went to the Air Force recruiting. Naturally, I was drawn to that because my father had been in the Air Force, and I was told Madam Waff, in other words, the lady who was in charge of the Women's Royal Australian Air Force, doesn't like her officers to be as young as you. I was 20, because they only marry air crew and leave. I mean, I decided I wanted to be an officer because I had a degree. So Madam Waff didn't like her girls to be as young as me because I only married air crew and leave. So I thought, right, we'll cross the Air Force off the list. The Army were very interested in me. And in fact, I applied for the Army and was accepted by the Army. And I also applied for the Navy. I like to have a, foot in each camp, so to speak, in case one rejected me. So I applied for the Navy, about which the information was very sketchy about what female officers did, because it was so small. Nobody could really tell me. And the Navy was also a very small service in those days in South Australia, whereas the Army was quite, obviously, it was just post-Vietnam, so the Army was still huge. So I applied for both the Army and the Navy, was accepted for both services, and then I had a decision to make. And why did I join the military? I guess I could see my friends becoming social workers, teachers, librarians, counsellors, lawyers, and it would be fair to say that at one time or another in my career in the Navy, I've done all of those things. And I also wanted to do something that I could be proud of, and I wanted to do something where I could travel, get out of Adelaide. My father used to say to me, if you want to be successful, you've got to go east. You've got to go east. You've got to get out of South Australia. And so that's what I did. But yeah, I think the Navy had a bit more mystique about it, not so well known. The recruiting officer worked hard on me to choose the Navy over the Army, because obviously recruiting was fairly small in Adelaide. He knew that I'd been accepted by the Army. So I had a long wait. I was accepted in February 1974, and I didn't join until September 1974. And although I joined to be an officer, the system in those days for women, and they made this very clear to me from day one, was that you don't join as an officer, you join as a recruit, the same as anybody joining the Navy. And I think it was the same in the Army. I'm not sure about the Air Force, because as Madam Waff didn't want people my age, I don't know much about the entry system then, but you joined as a recruit. You did the basic recruit course, the same as any other girl joining the Navy, and then you went off to do your officer training, as opposed to doing your cook's training or your communications training or your medics training. You went off and did your officer training.
So what was training like for you, with like obviously basic training and then officer training? What did you find hard during basic training, and what did you find hard during officer training?
Well, being a recruit, because we were recruit WRANS Officer Cadets, the five of us who joined to be officers had on our little name tags RWROC, which stood for Recruit WRAN Officer Cadet. whereas the other girls just had RWR. So they knew we were going to go on one day and be officers, hopefully, if we passed all exams, etc. So they knew right from the word go that we were going to be officers at one day. So now was a good time to give us a hard time while we were the same as them. So there was a lot of short sheeting of beds and, you know, a bit of a, but they weren't too bad. I actually found it really good to learn what it was like to be a female sailor, and by default a sailor in the Navy. The recruit training was very, very valuable in that I learned what it was like to be sailors, how female sailors lived and worked. That was absolutely invaluable. And of course, I learned really useful things that I didn't know how to do, like how to iron, how to clean, how to you know, all the things that my mother had done for me, I suddenly was taught how to do. And I also learned how to be on time. I had never been on time for anything in my life. And I realised probably about 5 minutes into my time in the Navy that they weren't really going to tolerate me being 15 minutes late for lectures like I used to be at university. I was such a good student that in my honours year, the Spanish lecturer would wait for me to turn up to start the lecture. And I realised that wasn't going to happen in the Navy. You know, I was going to wait for Sandy to turn up. So I learnt some very, very good, I learnt tidiness too. And I'm an incredibly tidy, neat, fastidious person. It's never left me, even though I'm no longer in the military. In fact, I'm much tidier than my husband. A voice would probably roar up from downstairs, no, you're not, but I consider I am. And I think that's because I started off as a recruit. So I learned some really good basic life skills that have not only stood me in good stead in the Navy, but have stood me in good stead in life. The officer training course was quite different. We did 5 weeks as recruit RANS, and after passing that, the 5 of us then moved on to do our officer training, and we were joined by a girl who had been a RAN and who was changing over to officer. So there were 6 of us, and it was like 10 green bottles, you know, that old song, 10 green bottles hanging on the wall.
Yep.
Well, that was what the course was like, because people kept dropping out all the way, and in the end there were only 2 of us finished the course. So that was pretty high wastage rate, 6 down to 2. But it was a funny system in that we weren't sailors anymore, but we weren't officers. So instead of being in no man's land, I'd say we were in no ran's land, because I was in the RAN. I was in no ran's land. You didn't really fit in anywhere. You weren't allowed to associate with the girls that you'd been recruits with anymore. You certainly weren't allowed to associate with officers, but we did. We had friends who were, you know, young male officers. I don't know how we made friends, because we were locked up most of the time, but we did. And on the weekends we had off, we'd go up into Melbourne, and there was a big house where some of the young officers from HMAS Torrens, which was in an extended refit, would stay. So we'd have a sleep on a camp stretcher or something there. And so we'd go into the officers' mess, which was absolutely forbidden for cadet RANs to use. And the captain of the ship was actually Captain David Martin, who you may have heard of. He went on to be Admiral Martin and then became the governor, much loved governor of New South Wales, and was known as the Sailors' Admiral. And he used to say, "Don't worry, girls, your secret is safe with me. I won't tell anybody that you've been in the officers' mess." And I used to think to myself, "Oh, I hope you don't, sir, because you're going to be in so much trouble." So from the officer training, I don't think I learned a great deal. It was really 4.5 months long, so it was very short. Some of it was valuable, like we learned a lot about the legal system of the Navy, because at various stages you would be prosecuting people, defending people. You learned how to be a divisional officer, which meant that you were responsible for the welfare of sailors, female sailors, and ultimately male sailors who worked for you. So there were some useful strands to it. I also learned how to instruct the Navy way, teach people the Navy way. We never had any disciplinary problems in a naval classroom, let me tell you. So there was some good sides of it. And instead of learning how to march in a squad, you learn how to take charge of a squad. So, you know, there was the odd funny incident. I'm a little bit short-sighted too. No one near as bad as my father. But I remember, because there were only 6 of us and eventually got down to 5, 4 and 3 and 2, so it wasn't very exciting marching such a small number of people around. So they would find a platoon of male sailors for us to march around. And I was giving orders one day, and I knocked my glasses with my hand, and, you know, you should have just kept on going. I didn't. I stopped to find my glass. I was searching around for my glasses, and this platoon of sailors is getting further off into the distance. They didn't march off the end of the wharf, fortunately. One of the petty officers stopped them. But the warrant officer who was running our course called me over to him, great big man, Warrant Officer Berry, his name was, Butch Berry, they called him. And I stood to attention in front of him, great big man. I was even smaller than I am now. And he said, I always allow people on my courses one mistake, and you've just made yours. And yet this same man would not let us march when the weather was cold. Can't have you young ladies out in the cold. So we'd watch films of parades that he'd organised. He'd been in the Queen's coronation parade because he'd started life in the Royal Navy, so we'd watch that. Or the freedom of entry of Melbourne. I watched that many times because we had to learn how to arrange freedom of entries to cities. So yeah, there was some useful stuff, and there was some not useful stuff. Some of my more cynical friends used to say, oh, it taught us how to make cucumber sandwiches and arrange cocktail parties, but no, it was and be good naval officers' wives. It wasn't quite as facile as that, but it was. Yeah, the recruit course was actually a lot more use than the officer training, I think.
So you mentioned that there was a high attrition rate with the girls, that you started with 6 and then you were down to 2. But did you also have much interaction with the males going through officer training, or was it just
none whatsoever? Pretty much none whatsoever. I think towards the end of the course, we were allowed to have a group of midshipmen come down and have soft drinks with us. But it was the middle of summer, and these young fellows arrived wearing overcoats, because in their pockets, the deep pockets of their overcoats, were bottles of gin. And the duty WRANS officer, who was the chief RAND, I think just turned her head, just, you know, allowed us a little bit of leeway. So no, there was very little interaction with you know, virtually none, unless you played squash. So we all took up squash, so that we could have some interaction with the midshipmen. There was very little interaction with the male officers under training, and there was very little interaction with junior female officers, of whom there were very few. There were a couple at HMAS Service, which is where my training was done, but none of them was ever given the opportunity to sit down and say, look, girls, you know, this is not what it's going to be like when you're commissioned. It'll be quite different. So just put up with this for the next few months and it'll all change. There was no opportunity for that at all. We were really quite a lonely little group of people.
I was just about to say that, Sandy, that it seems that you were like very much alone, and you really did you have, like, with the other, once you got down to the 2, did you and the other female become close and sort of try and inspire each other to get through, or?
Well, we were down to 3. And the 3 of us got on very well. And then there was a big final selection board, and the 3rd of us sadly failed that selection board. So then there were 2. So the 2 of us were commissioned, and the other girl, I stayed at HMAS Service and became a training officer in the recruit school, noting that I'd completed the recruit course in September 74, and I then ran the recruit course in May 75. We'll talk about that in a minute. So she was in Canberra, And I think about 18 months after, so we would ring each other up, obviously, but about 18 months after she joined the Navy, she married a submariner who was taking command of HMAS Orion, which was under construction in Scotland. So she got out of the Navy. So after that, there was just me. So,
so very much on your own. Very.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But I mean, once I was commissioned, obviously, there were some other female officers around, but not many. I suppose at Cerberus there would have been, maybe 5, I think, probably at maximum, yeah. So and then most places I went to after that, I was the only female officer.
So very much, Sandy, a trailblazer, making your own trail for females to come through later on.
It was just how it was. That there weren't that many. There were only about 25 WRANS officers in the Navy then, and there was a very small nursing service, which I think was even smaller than the number of WRANS officers, the Royal Australian Naval Nursing Service, which had, I think, about 22, 23 sisters. So there weren't very many female officers at all then. So if you wanted to have friends, you tended to be friends with the guys because they were the people who were around, and they were in the officers' mess, or the wardroom as it's called in the Navy, and so they became your mates, really.
Absolutely. So, and you just mentioned that your first tasking once you became commissioned was working at the recruits and officers training course. Can you tell us a little bit about your time there and what the role entailed?
Well, the WRANS training school was at HMAS Cerberus, and I stayed there. I think perhaps because I was younger than the other girl who'd been commissioned, so they probably thought she was probably more mature than I was, and she'd also worked. I came from uni and was a bit mouthy still, so I was kept under the eye of the OIC WRANS, the officer in charge of the WRANS. My job was a training officer in the recruit part of the WRANS training school. And as I said, having done the course in September 74, I ran the course in May 1975. I think I was a page ahead of the girls, maybe half a page ahead of the girls, because I was still learning myself. Our uniforms were tailor-made. Our winter uniforms were tailor-made. So I didn't have a uniform, so they had to find a small uniform for me to wear because Cerberus was cold, and so we changed into winter uniform in, I think, early April or something. So, it was all sort of a bit hodgepodge. But I speak a lot to the girls who I trained as recruits from that era, and they say, no, honestly, Sandy, it really didn't show. I mean, we knew, obviously, because there were still girls completing their specialisation training who had joined the Navy with me as a recruit. I mean, the officer course was shorter than some of the other training courses, particularly for communications RANs. That was quite a long training course. So they said, no, look, it really didn't show, their main memory of me is that I was very kind. And I thought, well, that's a bit boring, isn't it, to be remembered as being very kind? But I think when people are recruits, that they're away from home for the first time, and most of the girls were 18 who were going to be RANs. There's a lot of yelling and screaming and shouting from senior rank RANs, the NCOs. And other people. So having somebody who was there, who was kind, who would give a motherly eye on them at the age of 22 was probably not a bad thing. So I actually don't mind being regarded as having been kind. But my ignorance must have shown.
No, I think, Sandy, a good leader, and what I've learned especially through the RFS, and a good leader, and in life, a good leader is someone who can show empathy and
Absolutely.
there's times that you have to be there's times where you can be their friend, but then there's times where you have to be tough, and
Absolutely.
that in my opinion, that's a good leader. So you showing that to them it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's something to take away going, well, actually, I did an okay job, considering that, you know, you were, as you said, you were still learning your craft as well.
Absolutely, I knew very little, and yeah, and it was quite challenging, quite difficult, and there weren't many people to go to for advice. So you bumbled along as best you could, and if people remember you as kind and say, no, it didn't come over that you were only a page ahead of us. I think that's quite good, really.
Absolutely, and it's something that, you know, you grow into. Leadership it's something you've got to grow into, and it's something that I know myself. I know myself when I was 26 and when I became a crew leader, I almost handed my stripe back to my captain, because I struggled for 18 months. I really struggled to find the leader that I wanted to be, and also earn the respect of my peers. And it's any young person listening, Sandy, can take away that you've got to earn the respect before you can't just expect, because you hold a rank, you're going to get respected. You have to earn your respect. And it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's a vital lesson.
At that stage, I was still working out my leadership style too. What style of leader I was going to be. So, you know, these poor girls were my learning craft. But I really joined. I mean, everything changed for me when I got a posting to Sydney to Fleet Headquarters after 18 months in what I called the Rannery. I went to Fleet Headquarters in a quite difficult job, but it was a hodgepodge of jobs. But I was treated just like any other junior officer, male or female. You know, kicked around. It was a serious place. It was where the fleet was controlled from, and all of the fleet, or most of the fleet, all the big ships were in Sydney in those days. HMAS Sterling in the West hadn't opened up then. So I had some terrible jobs. I was responsible for mail to ships, and this is mail from families to ships, bearing in mind that this was the pre-computer age. So mail was very important. That was how, you know, wives communicated with their husbands. And I worked out that about 3 weeks was about as long as a ship could go without its mail before people started to get really toey. So I had a very good liaison with Australia Post, which was at Strawberry Hills in Sydney in those days. You might know it. I had a great big vault full of the Navy's secrets that I had distributed around the fleet. So I spent half my life walking around the naval dockyard, going up and down ladders on ships in my little white frock or my little black skirt, depending on the time of year, delivering the secrets for people to sign. I was responsible for visitors to ships, you know, every Boy Scout group, Probus Club or whatever that wanted to go and look at one of Her Majesty's Australian ships in Sydney went through my hands. And so ringing up, you know, a very busy executive officer of a ship and saying that you wanted to bring 30 Boy Scouts onto his ship on a weekend when he was, you know, really busy. I became probably the most unpopular person in the Navy in Sydney. You know, not you again, don't you bloody go away. You know, I really need to put these Boy Scouts on. Oh, I've done my share, you know, and then this phone would hang up. But so that was all useful. Parking at Gardner, parking for the Navy, and it was always a problem, always difficult because you know, the Navy was based in the centre of Sydney, and parking was at a premium. So getting allocated a spot on Garden Island when you went to sea for 6 months could be challenging. And I had responsibilities for that. And I'm just trying to think what else. I think that's probably about it. But there were a whole hodgepodge of jobs that nobody else wanted that were put together for the WRANS officer, because our director at one stage has said she would like a WRANS officer to serve at Fleet Headquarters with the real Navy. So I got that job, but boy, did I learn. I learned so much that couple of years, I wanted to stay there forever. But a couple of years after I think it's about, no, it wasn't 2 years, it was about 18 months after I had arrived, I was sent to be in charge of all the women at HMAS Watson, and that also included all the women at HMAS Cuttable and all the outstations. So I had about 120 women whose wellbeing I was responsible for, and I ran the accommodation for the RANS on the south side of Sydney, which was in what had been a Travelodge motel at Bondi. So that was a great job. So I became a head of department after 4 years in the Navy and was offered a permanent commission, because when I joined, it was 6 years and then you had to apply for extensions. But I got a permanent commission after 4 years. So I thought that was a bit of an achievement. So I was starting to do really well by then. So
Absolutely. And Sandy, what was your first, when you were posted to Sydney, what was your favourite part of that posting, and what did you take away from that first posting that you learnt about yourself?
Oh, what I learned about myself was that, I had a long way to go in becoming a naval officer, but I worked with some work, in the same area as some very fine naval officers who went right to the top of the Navy or close to the top of the Navy. So there were some really good leadership models there. I learned how to work under real stress, and I'd been there for a short time, and I asked if I could go on the watch bill to be the duty fleet staff officer, and there was much sucking and grinding of teeth because women just didn't go on that watch bill, because it meant that you were looking at ships programs, maybe making preliminary changes to them, and you'd get phone calls from wives who'd say, "Oh, can you tell me when HMAS Yarra's getting back?" "Oh, I'm sorry, madam, HMAS Yarra's been back for a fortnight." Of course, this poor lady would have a husband on the Yarra who hadn't been home for a fortnight. So there were little things like that would happen. But I asked if I could go on the watch bill, and eventually they agreed, and it was difficult. It was very difficult. There were some very challenging moments. And again, there were the snarly people. "I want to speak to the real duty fleet staff officer." "I am the real duty fleet staff officer." "Well, can you put Lieutenant Commander Beagley," he was the man who actually ran the fleet programs, "can you put him on?" And so I said, "Oh, sir, they want to speak to the real duty fleet staff officer." And he'd get on the phone and say, "You were speaking to the real duty fleet staff officer, Third Officer Heaver. I'll put her back on." And so, you have a bit of support as well.
Which I suppose, Sandy, in those days, and I hate to use those days, but back then it was seen as and you correct me if I'm wrong, it was seen that you were it was a real man's world back in the late 70s, early 80s, and women weren't supposed to be in those type of roles. So did you find did you find it challenging with your comrades on the ships, or were you treated with respect?
Oh, I've always treated with respect. I can honestly say that I have never, ever had I've certainly never been treated with disrespect by a sailor. Some of the officers could be difficult because they were busy, they were doing a job, and some of them saw you just as short-term people who'd marry a naval officer and leave. You weren't really regarded all that seriously. But some people like me, and probably my era of women, were the first era of ladies who married or were partnered and stayed on. Prior to my generation, the ladies who stayed on in the Navy tended to be single ladies who lived a different sort of lifestyle and stayed very much within the RANS world. Whereas my generation were probably the first who were starting to break out of that RANS world. And I saw that first job at Fleet Headquarters as being a good way of getting out of the RANS side of things. And I learned about the RAN. I learned about the Royal Australian Navy at Fleet Headquarters. And I had some really good role models, some really bad role models among some of the officers. And I think there were 3 RANs, 1 RANS officer initially, and then the fleet legal officer was a RANS officer. So that was great. So I actually had some company. There was one other female officer there, but and there was just a big headquarters full of blokes, all interested in getting the fleet to sea. So you realise how important that place was, and you felt that even though you were right down the bottom as a very junior officer, you were contributing to getting the fleet to sea and keeping it at sea. You know, even though it might have been just making sure that people got their mail or making sure that secret documents were what was pretty important and were getting to the right place. But yeah, that was a fantastic job for a junior officer. It really was.
Absolutely. And then how significant do you think your posting as the first female executive officer, so people who aren't aware, second in command of the Navy's submarine base HMAS Platypus from 1988 to 1990, was in terms of you personally and for women in the Navy?
Well, by then we'd all been transferred to the RAN. And how long had I been in the Navy? I joined in 74 and I went to Platypus in 87. But it was huge. We'd had 2 female executive officers. The first one had gone to HMAS Penguin, which was a training establishment in Sydney. Second one had gone to a very small base in Melbourne called HMAS Lonsdale, which was more reserves and students and a bit of admin, not taking anything away from that woman. She did a wonderful job and eventually finished up the CO. But HMAS Platypus was different. It was totally operational. It was submarines, which was very different. And submariners tend not to like surface Navy people. They call them skimmers. They skim across the surface. They're targets. And to have a skimmer in a skirt was going to be something very different for them. I can remember my boss, who became my mentor, said to me, "Well, Sandy," I was Lieutenant Commander at the time, so we'd been transferred to the Navy by then, so we had the same rank titles as males. "Well, Sandy," he said, "you're either going to leave there a commander or in a wooden box." And I said, "Well, I think I prefer the commander option, sir." But it was considered so different and so significant that the posting was actually announced in Parliament. Now, I'd been told I was being considered to be the executive officer of a base, and I thought, it'll be one of the administrative bases. It might be HMAS Harmer, which does all the admin for people in Canberra, or HMAS Cuttable, which is similar in Sydney. And I was told that one place we won't send you to, Sandy, is HMAS Platypus. It's a very difficult place for a non-submariner, and it'd be bloody impossible for a woman. So the next thing, I'm told, my posting to HMAS Platypus is going to be put out. Not only that, but it was mentioned in Parliament as an example of what the Hawke-Keating government is doing to make things more equal for women in the Defence Force. And I got a phone call from the Minister's advisor. I think the Minister was Minister Beasley, who was a great guy. I met him several times, very supportive of what I was doing. I got a phone call from his advisor to say, "Oh, look, Sandy, your posting to HMAS Platypus is going to be announced in Parliament this afternoon." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it's very significant, I think, for the government to be doing for women." And I thought, "Oh, okay." So, it's not much you can do. You can't say, "Well, no, I don't want it to be." But I had mixed feelings about it. And my husband in particular, I was married by then to Peter, he thought it was dreadful. He thought I should just be allowed to go there, get on, and do the job. And by doing things like announcing my posting in Parliament, you're almost setting somebody up to fail. And how awful would it have been to, for a question to be asked by the opposition 6 months down the track? "Well, Minister, I understand that a woman was posted to HMAS Platypus as a second in command of the base. and things have gone so badly that she's had to leave. You can imagine how bad that would have looked. And it would have meant that it would have been some time before another girl got the chance to have a job like that. So I was very aware of that. I always took the Julia Gillard philosophy to heart. That is that if you do a good job, you're going to make it that much easier for the next woman to come after you. That's how I've always operated.
So for you, Sandy, and you've just talked about it a bit, but did you feel pressure in that posting? Did you, like, when it was announced, and did you feel that there was a target on your back for what they had done in Parliament, or did you just want to get on with the job?
I just wanted to get on with the job, and I firmly believed that they had selected me for the job because they thought I could do the job. I'm in the Navy, and I knew the people who had selected me, even though they'd told me they weren't going to select me for that job, for that particular job, that particular place. I firmly believed that I'd been selected because they thought that I could do the job. I just hope the submariners didn't spend their afternoons listening to Parliament. They certainly did not. They were far too busy to worry about stuff like that. I also joined the squadron at a really difficult time, which was a bit more pressure in that they'd had a terrible incident where two young lads were working in the fin of the submarine, it was like the conning tower, and the submarine, the order was given to dive, and nobody was aware that these young fellows were working there. And so the submarine dived, they were in the fin, and they drowned, and their bodies were never found. So morale at the base was very, very low. People were still in a state of distress when I arrived, and that was also not so much out of pressure on me, but it was a sad place, and so it needed somebody there who was really, as the executive officer, who was really going to support them, help them get over that time, as well as doing what could at times be a very difficult job. I mean, I was in charge of the wharf. I barely knew what a wharf was, let alone manage one. I had 3 or 4 fleet utility boats that ran around Sydney Harbour that were my responsibility. I'd never had charge of boats before. The Navy had never taught me how to manage boats. But I was a bit of a cunning old dog by then, and I used my senior sailors, the NCOs, very effectively, and I would be very honest with them and say, look, Chief, I've not had anything to do with boats. You show me all about boats. Teach me all about boats. Show me what has to happen on the wharf. And so there were lots of questions like that I would ask, and they would be very flattered and very, very pleased that their expertise was being called on and their expertise was being respected. So that was, I made it very clear that I was coming. I was a good leader, a good manager, a very good administrator, but I didn't know about the operational side of submarines. I went to sea in the submarines as often as I could. I wasn't allowed to stay overnight in submarines because they were the rules in those days, but I stayed out as long as I could. So I would show an interest in them. And before I went to HMAS Platypus, I said to my husband, who was in the Fleet Air Arm, and he had spent a lot of time on HMAS Melbourne in the squadrons that were posted there. And he used to say that people would often say HMAS Melbourne was a great aircraft carrier if it wasn't for the Fleet Air Arm. I mean, an aircraft carrier without any aeroplanes, pretty silly. But so I learned from that, I was there to support submarines. Without submarines, submarine base would be a pretty stupid place. So my job was to support the submarines, and I devoted my entire time there to support those submarines and the submariners who went to sea in them. And I got on really well. Really from first, they were suspicious of me initially. There were all sorts of rumours going around that One of them was that everything was going to be painted pink. Everything in submarine squadron was black. Submarines are black. And all the bollards on the wharf were black, not white, like they are in shore bases where they're shore surface ships. And there were these rumours going around that I was going to have everything painted pink. And it was the most peculiar one I heard was that I wasn't going to allow people to drink coffee anymore. So I mean, silly little myths that went around. And when people actually met me and realised that I was quite a normal person and was just there to do a job and get on with them, all these little myths went away. So it was nowhere near as difficult as I thought it might have been.
And I was going to mention, Sandy, that you it was great delegation too with coming into the role of and also, as you said, and you mentioned it as well, respecting your peers as well, and that's what a good leader is. A good leader respects their peers and can take on board advice, and you showed that. So, well done on that, because it's sometimes some leaders they get ahead of themselves and they don't want to take it on. But it's a really key point that you touch on, that respecting your peers is something that is vital.
Well, they weren't my peers. They were the senior sailors, and I was by then a reasonably senior officer. But yeah, they were the people who had the subject matter. They were the subject matter experts, whereas I was coming in with no knowledge of a submarine base. But gee, I learned a lot from them. And I remember when I left, one of the guys that had worked for me in my early time at Platypus came into my office and cleared his throat several times, and he said, "I'd just like you to have this, ma'am." And then he scurried out. He was back serving at sea on a submarine by then. And I opened this envelope, and inside was this poem that he had written to me, for me, and about me. And it was just absolutely wonderful, the things he said in it. And it was really written from the heart. So when you get things like that, it really makes what you've done really worthwhile. Almost brings a tear to my eye thinking about it. He was a pretty hard guy, but he'd written this poem. It was just wonderful. And I'd get postcards from some of the submarines when they went up top, as it was called, when they went to Southeast Asia. There'd be a postcard would arrive with dirty fingerprints on it, because submarines were dirty things at times, grubby things, restricted showering in those old Oberons, which was the class of submarine that the Navy was operating in. It was the Oberon class submarine, not the Collins class. So I get this postcard and it said, "Dear ma'am, we've just arrived in Penang, having a great time. Wish you were here. Probably just as well you're not. Love, the HMA. See you in 6 months. Love, the HMAs always jokers." And I get postcards like this, and I put them up on my wall, and it really quite touched me. From somebody who could have been a disaster, to get stuff like that, I thought was really good, because I was there trying to help them, basically, and trying to do a good job for them.
And how long was that posting, Sandy? Like you were there? Was that
3 years? Nearly 3 years. Yeah, I got promoted towards the end, so I became a commander. So I had to leave, but I managed to have it spun out for a little bit longer. But I mean, I was ready to leave, and they were ready to have someone else. I mean, can't stay there forever. But look, it wasn't all beer and skittles. I had my moments. I had a disagreement once with the guy who was the captain there for most of my time there, who I absolutely admire and adored. But we had a disagreement about something, and I said to him, "Well, sir, if that's the way you're going to be, I think you might have to find yourself another executive officer." And he said, "Well, that's fair enough, Sandy, but I don't want to lose you, because I think you're doing a great job." But he said, "But just remember that if you do go," he said, "you'll always be remembered as the woman who couldn't cut it as the executive officer of a submarine base." So I went home. It was Friday, and I went home, And I said to Peter, oh, this is what's happened, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I think you both need to think about it over the weekend and then apologise to each other on Monday. Anyway, so I got in on Monday and went to see the captain. And he said, because he knew Peter very well, because Peter was an anti-submarine person in aeroplanes. He spent a lot of his life hunting for submarines. He said, so what did Peter think? And I said, well, he thinks that we should sort of kiss and make up, apologise to each other and get on with things. And he said, well, I'd like to say I'm sorry, Sandy, because you were actually right. But I said, well, no, it's all right, sir. I'm really sorry, and I shouldn't have said what I said. So we just got on. So, yeah. So, sometimes the old husband's got a good bit of advice there tucked away. But, so it wasn't all beer and skittles. We had our moments where I, disagreed with people over things and, but again, because I was a woman, we'd do rounds every fortnight. And the first time I did rounds, and I had 3 different COs in my 3 years there. The captain always goes first, followed by the executive officer. But because I was a woman, I'd stand back for the lady to go first. It was still that era. And I'd say, no, sir, I'm just the XO, you first, me second. But it was just that, I guess it was ingrained in men of that generation as well, that you let the lady go first.
Well, it's sadly, yeah, sad. I was about to say that. Sadly, that's something that's lost. And Sandy, I thank my parents, and especially my mum and my nana and my pop, because they instilled in me that, you do open car doors for ladies. You offer your seat on a train, and I know people go, what are you talking? But no, I was taught respect. I was taught that, and I have had it thrown back in my face, Sandy, now. Like, I've had it a few times where I offered my seat. I was with my mum and I offered my seat to a pregnant lady, and she said, I'm not an invalid, I'm only pregnant. And it made me feel terrible. And especially to the elderly, I had another similar thing, and the lady yelled at me. My mum said, look, he's only trying to help you. Like, he's a young fella. And it's perceived very different these days. It's very different to when you. Yes,
the pendulum has perhaps swung a bit too far in some ways. But that's just a personal opinion. But
exactly.
I can remember as a very junior officer, some of the senior male officers would salute you because that was just a gesture of respect, politeness to a woman, and you think, I'm saluting you and you're saluting me. It was a bit, but it was just, and they were people of their generation and their time.
Absolutely.
So you didn't want to, get all feminist on people who were trying to do the right thing.
No, that's right. So what did you find most challenging, and what did you take away from this posting that helped you going forward in your career?
What was most challenging? Well, I guess probably my lack of knowledge of just fundamental naval things that now women, of course, know all about. And the female officer training system changed 4 years after I finished my training, and then women started to do the same training as men. So I thank the Lord that the old training system that I did was out the window. So certainly that was very challenging. Other than that, I think just learning how submarines operated, just a big sort of knowledge gap that I had. One thing I found absolutely essential was to get on with the officers' wives, because they heard that a female officer was coming to be the executive officer. So there was a bit of suspicion. So I had a function very early on, and it was a ladies' dining in night, as they were called in those days, now called partners dining in nights, but ladies' dining in nights in those days. and brought my husband along with me so they could see that I was a happily married woman. And some of the wives became my greatest supporters. They just thought it was great. Once I got to know them and they got to know me, that I was no threat, wasn't going to run away with their husbands. So there were things that, sensitivities and things that you perhaps, you could perhaps take for granted that I had to learn, that you had to tread carefully and warily and learn as I went along. But I think I came away from that place a much better leader, probably a tougher person, because, some of the submarine commanding officers could be very difficult, very demanding. They did a course in England called the Perisher course, and a lot of people didn't survive that course. They were pretty tough guys. They knew what they wanted, and they were going to get it, and their submarine was going to be treated the best because it was the best submarine in the squadron. So I had to learn to be tougher and firmer. So I learned to be a tougher, firmer person at times. But really, I was always treated with great respect. The guys were great. I heard people swear and they'd be so apologetic. Not that I cared. If I dropped something heavy on my foot, I probably would have used exactly the same word that they had, and I would say that to them. And I think that, made them feel, quite comfortable about me being around a workshop or whatever, where you're obviously going to hear a lot of swearing, whereas people go about their business. But nobody deliberately swore or was disrespectful. And yet when I'd done my initial training, I'd been told by a senior male officer that they would be very disrespectful because nobody would accept female officers, and that was actually told to us as a course. So, but it never proved to be the case. And HMAS Platypus, if I was going to get into strife, that was the one place where I could have got into strife, but I never did. The CO, my first CO, said to me he just wanted someone who could do the job. That he didn't care whether I was a little green man from Mars or a little green woman from Mars. He just wanted someone who could do the job. And if you could do the job, that was it. And it didn't matter what you.
And you did the job, and you did it to a very high standard.
Yeah. We had a shore base gets inspected every 2 years, and our inspection time came around, and we got this absolutely brilliant inspection report, and the base did. And in the report, it mentioned that it was in no small way due to the efforts of the Executive Officer, Lieutenant Commander Sandy Coulson. To get that signed by the Chief of the Navy in green ink, because the Chief always uses green ink, was just such a wonderful thing. But the night that we were celebrating the great success, what we thought, we hadn't received the report then, but what we thought was going to be a very successful inspection, one of our young sailors was killed. So suddenly, from having a really happy, joyous occasion, we all went home feeling terribly sad. So, the tide can turn very quickly. So
absolutely, and it's like you said, Sandy. You've just touched on the point that life is short, and you've got to make the most of every moment that you're on this earth, and life is the greatest gift. And for you, looking back now, like for you at the time, were you seeing that you were achieving some absolutely amazing, achievements and accomplishments, and that you'd be able to do what you had done from, leaving school, of like your dad said to you, get out and go at the time. Go east. Had you stopped to see what you had achieved at that point?
I guess I thought, when I joined the Navy, I never thought I'd be the executive officer of a submarine base. I that just wasn't considered possible. And in 1974, I joined the Navy. In 1988, I was executive officer of a submarine base. So, it was just not within my realms of. I thought I'd have a 6-year career in the Navy and be gone. And if I'd stayed working as part of the WRANS organisation, I probably would have gone, really, because, my first posting I didn't particularly find all that interesting. But, some of the WRANS, being the unit officer WRANS, a head of department for the girls that were at different bases, they were great jobs too. So, and I spent a lot of my time working with families as well, with Navy families and ultimately with Defence families. So, Platypus wasn't just the only good job, but it was definitely the most interesting and definitely the most challenging, and was one that I just never dreamed I would have, particularly having been told that was one place where they would never send me. So you can never believe people who are your career managers. I decided after that. But no, it was, I learned so much from that job and took away some incredibly useful knowledge. I mean, I wasn't, the captain had two people under him. One was me, the executive officer, who looked after the base, and then there was a guy called Commander SM, who was responsible for the submarines, and the captain controlled everything, in both the base and the submarines. But the captain's real focus was the submarines. I mean, he had 6 Oberon submarines that they had to get to sea and refit, and they went on all sorts of interesting patrols. So the captain's focus was very much on the submarines, and rightly so. So I was very much in charge of the base, but working very much to the commanding officer. I mean, I know when I first got there, we had some boats that I mentioned, and the guys didn't show much interest in the boats. They sort of moved around the harbour, but the sailors wouldn't be wearing their caps. They'd be smoking. The boats would be blowing smoke. And I got this phone call from the admiral who was in charge of the Sydney area, from his secretary, his senior principal advisor, and the words went something like this: Admiral Horton would like to say that he thinks you're doing a great job over there at the submarine base, Sandy. He knows you've got a hard job and he thinks you're doing very well. However, he was afloat in his barge this morning and one of your boats was blowing smoke, paid no marks of respect to the admiral. The sailors did not have their caps on, and some of them were smoking. So could you please attend to it? So I got the guys in and said, come on, guys, this is not good enough. Got to change this. And in the finish, they were doing boat drill, which is all the really fancy stuff that you'll see the Queen's boat drivers do. And they were doing it for me. And, I'd hear them say, come on, we've got to get this right for the XO. We've got to get this right for the XO. And, it was just really good. So a bit of good leadership and working with people, it can make a huge difference and can change people's behaviour and give them pride in themselves so that they don't feel that they've got to, smoke when they're in a boat in the harbour and be seen by the admiral. Get me into trouble. So I go down and get them into trouble. It was, people wanted to do things for me in the finish. So it was, I thought that was perhaps one of my successes, was getting people to work with me, I like to say, rather than work for me, work with me to try and make things better. And that made things better for everybody.
I think, and just talking to you, it's something that I've taken away is that goal setting, Sandy, like being and having a goal and setting and not listening to people that say you can't do something. Like, when you were sent there was so many people that wanted you to, well, they put pressure on you, announcing in Parliament, fail. And it's your resilience to go, no, I'm gonna prove you wrong. And I think for anyone listening, it's something that I've picked up through my journey, and I spoke to you about my mental health struggles, and it's something that I've picked up in the last 7 years through the work I've done. is goal setting is so important. So anyone out there who is listening, take it from Sandy that you set goals, and don't ever let anyone knock you off your, the goal that you're setting, and go and just chase your dreams, because Sandy, you're living proof of that. Like, you are living proof of, if you had have listened to the people that were knocking you, you wouldn't have been able to achieve what you've achieved.
Not at all. No. Or I would have, gone to some boring little posting in Canberra and stayed there, like a lot of the other girls did do at that time, and just stayed in Canberra and not done the hard yards, if you know what I mean. And because it was hard yards.
Oh, absolutely.
It was hard yards.
And
it was uncomfortable.
I was just about to say that, Sandy. You from speaking to you, you look like a person that will go outside your comfort zone, and I say that to anyone now: get outside your comfort zone and go and chase those dreams. And and get out of it's uncomfortable, it's confronting, and you've got to, you either, as it's an old saying, but you either sink or you swim, and that's what it is. You either thrive in it or you drown. So
absolutely. And I mean, look, being the executive officer of a submarine base, we don't have our own submarine base now. The submarines are just HMAS Sterling with all the fleet units, but if you said to a female officer, "Oh, you're going to be the executive officer of a submarine base," they just say, "Oh, yes, okay, fair enough." But in that era, it was just so, it was so different. It was just such a different job. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so,
as I said to you at the start, I'm a product of my era.
Well, as I said to you,
product of my era.
As I said to you when we before we started the podcast, you were a trailblazer for my generations and the generations after you coming through, that you have given them so much more opportunities than what you had when you started.
That was part one of our two-part conversation with former Navy Commander Sandy Coulson, CSM. Join us next week for part two.